Welcome to the Trails Regional Library Missouri Bicentennial Virtual Speaker Series. My name is John Taylor, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Central Missouri. The History and Communication programs at UCM are proud to partner with the Trails Regional Library on this virtual speaker series. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Amy Laurel Fluker. Dr. Fluker received her undergraduate degree in American history from Westminster College in Fulton, and her master's and PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. She is currently serving as assistant professor of history at Youngstown State University, where she also holds the Robert W. Reeder Memorial Endowed Professorship in History. She is the author of The Recuperative Powers of Missouri, Reconciliation in a Border State, which is the Missouri Historical Review, published in the April 2020 issue, and also of the forthcoming article, also published in the review, Earnest Endeavor, Missouri Women, and the Work of the Civil War Commemoration. Most recently, she is the author of Commonwealth of Compromise, Civil War Commemoration in Missouri, which the University of Missouri Press published in 2020. So please welcome Dr. Fluker.
Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this series. This is a privilege for me to be able to share my research with you. I grew up in Jefferson City, but in the sort of 10 years I spent researching and writing this book, I was living in Mississippi and in Ohio, so it's fun to be able to talk about this in a forum with some fellow Missourians. And as you pointed out, the research I wanted to share today is drawn from my book, Commonwealth of Compromise, which looks at Missouri's unique Civil War history and details how a diverse range of Missourians, men, women, African Americans, Union and Confederate veterans, tried to make sense of their experiences in the Civil War after it was over. So the book looks at a period from about 1865 to 1945, and some of the aspects of commemoration I deal with include veterans associations, monuments, Emancipation Day celebrations, and the veterans' homes, which I thought I would focus on for our talk today. So I argue that Civil War commemoration in Missouri was a real challenge because Missouri was a border state and Missourians fought on all sides of the conflict, and their divisions remained very deep and very painful after the war. In fact, I argue that Missouri's war was so unique and so painful that it sometimes served as a bonding experience for Missourians, particularly for white Missourians who felt that really nobody else in the country understood the tragedy of the Civil War as well as they did. So this sense of the tragedy of the war provided Missourians with a kind of common sense of identity that helped them pick up the pieces. And this is what we'll see today as we review the history of Missouri's two veterans' homes. Two separate homes, both united by a common set of experiences and chiefly a desire to provide care for the state's aging veterans. So I wanted to start this history with a story, and that story takes us to February 11th, 1897, to the state capitol in Jefferson City. On that day, the Senate was nearing a vote to determine whether or not the state government should assume control of the state's two privately funded homes for Civil War veterans, the Missouri Confederate Home in Lafayette County and the Federal Soldiers' Home in Phelps County. Missouri was the first state to establish homes for both Union and Confederate veterans, and so the idea that the state would adopt both and fund both of these homes was really unprecedented, and so this legislation took on a tremendous amount of symbolic importance. So here we are in the Senate chamber, February 11th, 1897. The first senator who gets up to speak is Henry H. Hohenchild, the young Democratic senator from Phelps County, and he spoke on behalf of the Federal Soldiers' Home that day. He gave a speech that was later described as one of the most beautiful orations heard in the Senate chamber for years. Hohenchild spoke about the importance of reconciliation in the aftermath of the war for Missourians. And he said that for the state to adopt both of these veteran homes would be a remarkable tribute to the reconciliation of Missouri's people. He said, quote, "As Missouri contributed brave soldiers to both armies, she will set an example to her sister states by taking under her sheltering care these homes." He said, if passed, the legislation would serve, quote, "as an enduring record of what this present generation deemed most worthy to be honored." The adoption of the homes, he insisted, would offer testimony to the harmonious spirit of Missouri's people, rooted in their common values and future goals. He concluded, quote, "May the dawn of the 20th century break on no more wondrous scene than the people of Missouri, forever banded by the indissoluble links of friendship, love, and patriotism, to differ nevermore." Hohenstield then turned the floor over to his colleague, another Democratic senator, Charles H. Vandiver from Lafayette County. Vandiver was a Confederate veteran and a long-standing advocate of the Missouri Confederate Home. I found an account of his speech in the St. Louis Republic, and the newspaper noted that when Vandiver got up to speak, the empty right sleeve of his jacket fell to his side, and this was a pretty poignant reminder of the hardships still endured by many of the state's veterans, including Vandiver. He spoke about his service in the Confederate Army, and he also spoke about his memories of fraternizing with Union soldiers in the war, trading coffee and tobacco and things of that nature. And he also spoke about how generously Union veterans had already treated the Missouri Confederate Home. He said Union veterans had given the home more than $10,000 in private donations. He concluded his speech saying, quote, "I want to say now, as one who was a Confederate soldier, who followed Lee from Manassas to Gettysburg, from the Wilderness to Petersburg, was thrice wounded with his face to the foe, and left an arm to molder in the Old Dominion, that I cast my vote for this bill." And according to the newspaper, it was this amazing and profoundly emotional moment. People are going wild with applause and sobbing and reaching for their handkerchiefs. So it was quite an emotional occasion. The bill passed with only one dissenting vote, and so the two Missouri veterans' homes were adopted by the state government. Hohenstield and Vandiver were really proud of their accomplishment in this respect. Hohenstield said, quote, "I congratulate myself that I'm a citizen of a state that is endeavoring to link all sections by caring for the old soldiers of both armies." Vandiver echoed these feelings and said, "I am proud of grand old Missouri that has shown a spirit broad enough and a liberal policy in this respect. She is the first state in the Union to become the mother of twin soldiers' homes." Vandiver said, quote, "It was like laying a joint tribute on the altar of forgiveness and forgetfulness." So these two veterans' homes, I think, are a really unique way to talk about Civil War commemoration in Missouri. And we don't often think of veterans' homes as Civil War monuments, but they certainly are. And in the case of Missouri, no other monument or commemorative activity approaches the amount of time and expense that was dedicated to these two homes. Hohenstield said, quote, "A people carves its own image in the monuments of its generosity." And I think in the case of these two veterans' homes, that was literally the truth. And they can provide really interesting insight into how Missourians dealt with their Civil War history. So before I sort of get into a history of first the Confederate home and then the Federal soldiers' home, I wanted to set the stage a little bit. And to do that, I have to talk about the first attempt to establish veterans care in the state. And this takes us 10 years prior to the speeches we just heard, to 1887. So one of the things to know about veterans' homes is that the time in which these homes emerged was a time before really the emergence of the welfare state. And the idea that the government should provide some kind of welfare or relief for veterans wasn't widely accepted. And so this was a problem. And so in 1887, when Missourians talk about providing some kind of care for veterans for the first time, there's a lot of backlash to this. So in that year, Representative John Daniel introduced House Bill 137 to establish a soldiers' home for Union veterans in Missouri. Unfortunately, this bill was destroyed in the state capitol fire in 1911, so the text is unclear. But again, he asked for an appropriation. It's seemingly for Union veterans only. But there was, like I said, a huge backlash to this proposed legislation. In part, it had to do with the fact that it would be for Union veterans. There were a number of Union and Confederate veterans in the legislature. And there was back and forth on whether or not Confederates should be admitted to the home. And there were some Union veterans who said, yeah, that would be great. And some Confederate veterans who said no. So it was a really messy situation. But the legislators also disagreed on whether or not the state should be spending its money in this way, which I thought was really interesting. At the time, most Americans felt charity should only be applied to deserving individuals, and that was their sort of terminology. People who were deserving were those whose difficult circumstances were not the result of any, moral failing as they saw it at the time. And so for a veteran to accept any kind of charity would be to sort of cast a shadow over his manliness and character. To give you a sense of this, Representative Henry A. Newman, who was a Confederate veteran, he said, this idea is great, and I appreciate the Union veterans who said they would be willing to admit Confederates to this proposed home, but he said, quote, "The Confederate soldier was wrapped in a halo of glory and romance, and he would not dim it by making him a pensioner." So again, the idea that these veterans might become charity cases was viewed as sort of, again, casting a shadow on their characters. So this bill was defeated, a vote of 69 to 62. And again, that's 10 years before the events that we heard earlier. So a couple interesting things, again, to help us contextualize and make sense of Missouri's veterans' homes. One, the deep wartime divisions that still existed in the state. And two, these conflicting attitudes about whether or not it was appropriate for the government to spend money on welfare initiatives. So that said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the Missouri Confederate Home first. This project was begun by an organization called the Ex-Confederate Association of Missouri. This was a society that formed in 1881. In 1889, they formed the Confederate Home Association to begin planning for the construction of this home in earnest. And in 1890, the association purchased about 360 acres of farmland outside of Higginsville to establish this home. This put the home right in Lafayette County, in the heart of Little Dixie, one of the regions of the state that was most strongly associated with the Confederacy during the Civil War. Excuse me. Despite that region's reputation, though, the reputation of Little Dixie, the ex-Confederates struggled to raise money for the home. And this was surprising for me as I did my research. One veteran, O.H.P. Catron, complained, quote, "There are too few Confederates in this portion of Missouri to support the home." And so the veterans' work really stalls until the Daughters of the Confederacy take up this cause. So the Missouri Daughters of the Confederacy was an organization for women who could claim a male relative in the Confederate Army. And they became the sort of founding chapter of the organization we still know today as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So they started as the Missouri Daughters, they became the UDC. So the Daughters take up this work of fundraising for the home, and they're much more successful. And I think this has a lot to do, again, with gendered attitudes at the time. While it was, the idea of accepting charity might cast a shadow on men's character, people consider it very appropriate for women to be interested in charitable causes. So these women are very successful. They hosted dances and picnics. They sold bricks. They did all kinds of things to raise money for the home. They raised $100,000. And they began construction on the main building of the Higginsville Confederate Home. The veterans were very grateful. Catron, who we heard from a moment ago, said, quote, "The women, God bless them, have nobly done their part. Without them, the Confederate home of Missouri would never have been built." So the women are really important to ultimately the successful construction of this home, but they also had assistance from Union veterans, from the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the largest organization for Union veterans, the GAR. So the GAR raised a lot of money on behalf of the Confederate home, and it's not always clear why. I think there's a few reasons they did this. I think first and foremost, they felt a shared bond as veterans with these needy Confederates. Also, they might have had some romantic considerations. Historian Nina Silber has written about the very frequent marriages between Union veterans and Confederate women and how this helped make reconciliation seem more possible in the United States. And this was certainly the case in Missouri. I found a story in the St. Louis Republic that mentions a Union veteran named Major James Adams, who was raising money for the Confederate Home. And the paper said, quote, "Adams was a gallant federal soldier and a prominent member of the GAR, but he ably seconds his wife in her work for the Confederate Home, as do a number of the GARs." So veteranhood, maybe their wives are involved with the daughters. I think another reason Union veterans support the home is because some of them may have agreed with ex-Confederates politically. So many ex-Confederates were Democrats, and it may be that Democratic Union veterans felt some kinship with them. And this was certainly the case for Grove Young, the Union veteran whose land the home sits on. So Grove sold this property to the Confederate Home Association. He even reduced his asking price as a goodwill gesture to the ex-Confederates, and he left a small endowment to help support the home as well. The daughters explained, quote, "The actions of carpetbaggers and other Northern actions after the war made him sympathetic with the South." So again, it could be that these Union veterans had some political agreement with ex-Confederates. First and foremost, a shared opposition to the policies of the radical Republicans, I would suspect chiefly in relation to their policies for greater racial inclusion. Well, whatever their motivations were, the press was always very excited to capitalize on these stories of Union veterans supporting the home. The Boonville Weekly Advertiser said, quote, "Past differences of opinion are having no influence in the matter, but the old veteran and his friends are coming with open hands to help those who started the enterprise." In the Confederate Veteran magazine, the assistance of Union veterans was also praised. The veteran observed that the Missouri Confederate Home was, quote, "a monument attesting peace and Christian charity in a state where war was waged more bitterly than ever before on American soil." And it gave at least one Missourian reason to hope, and this is 30 years after the war's conclusion, that, quote, "the war is about over." So the cooperation of Union veterans and the support they gave for the home made for good and sentimental and emotionally charged press, but there were also always tensions bubbling beneath the surface in this fundraising effort on behalf of the home. So while some individual Union veterans sympathized with the plight of these Confederates, the Department of Missouri Grand Army of the Republic wanted it to be really clear that they saw a distinction between supporting veterans and supporting the so-called lost cause of the Confederacy. In 1891, the Ransom Post of the GAR warned its members against helping the Confederate Home Association when, quote, "such solicitations are accompanied by an attempt to honor the lost cause or by a display of the folds or figure of the rebel flag." And so what they were concerned about there was that as the Confederate Home Association was reaching out to Union veterans and doing their fundraising efforts, their stationery had a Confederate flag and the letterhead. And this really angered the Union veterans. Ransom Post called the use of the Confederate flag on the stationery basically unacceptable. And they expressed regret, quote, "that those most prominent and active in behalf of the Confederate home seem unwilling or unable to separate feelings of charity from feelings of esteem for the unworthy dead cause for which those men fought." Another post of the GAR passed resolutions calling the Confederate flag, quote, "an emblem of treason and rebellion," and said, quote, "it is in bad taste and ill-advised zeal to come in charity's name flaunting that flag in any form of manner, and however small, it is an insult to the GAR." So again, lots of occasions when the cooperation of Union veterans was celebrated, but I think this is also an indication of, again, this tension that Union veterans could be prevailed upon to provide some assistance for needy veterans, but absolutely were not willing to endorse the Confederate cause or the Confederate side of the Civil War in any way. All this said, these fundraising issues sort of aside, the Missouri Confederate Home was finally opened and dedicated on June 8th, 1893. So this is the so-called main building of the Confederate Home. You can see some veterans on the porch, which I think is neat. These images are from slightly later. You can see the main building in the distance there, and administration building in the foreground. Of course, these buildings were built over a period of years, even decades, as the home grew and expanded. Here's the main building on the left and the hospital building on the right. And the chapel, pictured here in the early 1950s, looking a little worse for the wear, but it still stands today, and you can visit the chapel at the Confederate State Park. So now I'll turn the tables a bit and talk about the Missouri Federal Soldiers Home, which I think is really interesting. There's much less research that's been done on this Federal Soldiers Home than on the Confederate Home. So this is a part of my project that I really enjoyed working on. So while the Confederates were working to construct their home, Union veterans are interested in doing the same. In this case, the effort to build a state home for federal soldiers was really championed by a group of women called the Women's Relief Corps. This was a society for any, quote, loyal woman. You did not have to be a relative of a Union soldier. And many of the members were former Army nurses. So the Women's Relief Corps, or WRC, really takes up the challenge of creating this federal soldiers home for Missouri. Their strategies are very much like those used by the Daughters on behalf of the Confederate Home. But the real difference in their approach is that the WRC wanted to provide not just a home for veterans, but for their wives and for Army nurses as well. So they wanted to be sure that women would be admitted to their home. In 1894, the WRC formed the Missouri Soldiers Home Association and began raising money for this end. They struggled to get off the ground though, and this was really interesting to me. They felt a little aggrieved about the slowness of their fundraising, especially given the support Union veterans had lavished on the Confederate Home. One WRC member, Belle Satterlee, pointedly observed, quote, "I feel sure that if the GAR will give to the Women's Relief Corps the support they have given to another home in the state of Missouri, we shall soon have a soldier's home." But the WRC also understood that they were operating in a difficult context in a border state. WRC President Orpha Bronson said, quote, "We must remember we're living in a state that does not sympathize with our boys in blue as they do in the East. Thus, there is more need for the Women's Relief Corps to do in this state for the Union veteran than in any of the Eastern states." In 1895, the WRC finally needed the support they needed to build their home when the residents of St. James, Missouri donated the Dunmore Mansion, and I'll show you an image of that here. Here it is. This is the Dunmore Mansion in St. James. It was a 34-room mansion that cost $20,000, and the residents of the city donated this home and 60 acres to the Federal Soldiers Home Association. This was really an ideal solution for them because they didn't have enough money to do a new construction, but the home was in pretty bad shape, and St. James was also kind of a strange location. One newspaper later observed, quote, "The federal home was mistakenly located here in the first place, in the wrong town, in the wrong country, among a people who never had much sympathy for the old federal soldier." The federal home formally opened on October 25th, 1896, and I suspect this photo might be the dedication ceremony, though I can't prove that for sure. I have some more images of the home over the years that I'll show you here. Here's an image of a superintendent's cottage and some Union veterans at the federal home. Another view of the superintendent's cottage and also the entrance to the federal home grounds. These images, I suspect, are from the early 1920s. the residents pretty quickly outgrew that mansion, the Dunmore Mansion. And so in following decades, these dormitory buildings were constructed. There were at least two. And so here's dormitory number 1. A separate hospital building, which was constructed in the early 1920s. And here's a view of the soldier cemetery on the grounds of the home as well. And you can sort of see the Dunmore Mansion there in the distance. So now that we've got the 2 homes built, I thought I would talk a little bit about their admission requirements. So both homes were kind of similar in this respect. Both homes required residents to be honorably discharged from their respective armies and to be free of any kind of, quote, vicious habits, chronic disease, or insanity. Both homes also were really making an effort with those kind of criteria to be able to prove that even though the residents were accepting charity or welfare, that they were deserving, right? They weren't there because of any faults of their own. They had no other options, essentially. Even among this very select group of residents, though, there were some tensions. Some of the tension at the federal home came from the presence of German-born residents. So I'm sure, as we know, Missouri had a large population of German immigrants, and many of those men fought for the Union and did so bravely and with distinction. But there was a lot of prejudice against German-born residents at the home, which is very strange because the German-born population in the home, and they kept track of this, was usually about a quarter of the residents were German-born. And there were German-born veterans on the board of trustees, but still there was some tension there. I found a complaint one resident submitted saying he overheard a member of staff telling the superintendent's wife she ought to poison all the Dutch. At the federal home, African Americans were barred from admission. I have no evidence of their presence either as residents or as staff members at the home, which is a little unusual, only in that Missouri's only officially segregated institutions were its schools, but of course, more informal kinds of segregation existed throughout the state. And so while the federal home didn't explicitly exclude Black veterans, I'll share my screen again, I have some indication of why Black veterans did not apply or reside there, and that is that apparently the Ku Klux Klan actually made its headquarters in the federal home. So I found this letter dated November 14th, 1900. This is from resident Jerry Keller to Louis Beneke, who is president of the Federal Home Board. And he says it is well known that the local KKK makes its headquarters in the home. And he included these 2 notes that you see on the right, threatening himself and another resident to get out of this home or be hanged, essentially. It's unclear why the Klan targeted these 2 residents. It could be because one of the men, Bo Kemper, in the first note here, was German-born. So perhaps the threat of violence and intimidation kept Black veterans out of the federal home. Here's another clue, though, to understanding their situation. In 1921, so this is years later, the Missouri State Board of Charities and Corrections did an investigation on the conditions of Black soldiers and Black citizens in various state institutions. And so in this report, the federal home said that they had, quote, no arrangements or quarters for Black residents. And you can imagine this kind of policy put Black veterans at a disadvantage, who are not only dealing with all the same problems associated with, aging and needing Civil War veterans, but they're engaging with this infrastructure that neither outrightly prohibits or welcomes them. And so here's a little screenshot of the report. And if you look towards the bottom there, we have the state federal soldiers home listed. It says, quote, do they admit colored? No. It goes on to explain there are no arrangements or quarters for them. If you note just below that line, the state Confederate home is also included in this report. Admits, quote, colored? No. No explanation was apparently needed as to why the Confederate home would not admit Black residents. I should say, though, that there were African Americans who worked on the staff of the Confederate home. And apparently enjoyed popularity with the veteran residents. I think this is a reflection of the idea that, right, former Confederates could point to the willingness of these Black Missourians to work at the home as some kind of evidence that they supported, you know, the Confederate cause, when in reality, these Black members of staff would have had lots of different personal reasons for taking these jobs. And certainly the Confederate home was not a shrine of racial tolerance. On one occasion, the Confederate Home Board expelled a veteran for insisting, quote, "a Negro was as good as a white man." Both homes admitted women, as was true to sort of their founding ideas. The federal home admitted both wives and widows and nurses. So as early as 1896, the Missouri Federal Soldiers Home was admitting nurses. The national US Soldiers Homes did not admit nurses until 1928. So I think that's pretty interesting. Another kind of first for Missouri there. The Confederate home went a step even further and admitted not only wives and widows, but also families, including children under the age of 14. So I couldn't find a good image of it, but the grounds of the Confederate home also included 15 small cottages, which were for Confederates, their wives, and dependent children. So both homes, right, operated on private charity for just a few years. In the case of the federal home, only a few months before February 1897, where we began this story, when both homes were taken under control of the state administration. This was a necessity because of the growing populations of both homes and their inability to exist on private funding. So as we heard, the respective boards of these homes proposed a state takeover, and that's indeed what happened in February of 1897. And so this was praised as this great moment of Missourians coming together. But again, we can see that there were wartime tensions kind of lingering after the state takeover. There was a lot of suspicion at both homes that the government was showing favoritism to one home over the other. One federal home superintendent, Wilbur Henry, complained, quote, "It seems quite reasonable that appropriation for salaries for this institution should be nearly or quite as much as for the Confederate home at Higginsville." He begged, quote, the legislature to treat these institutions fairly. And it was true that the Confederate home received a larger state appropriation, but there was a reason for that. The federal home was also subsidized by about $100 a year for every veteran in residence, because those men claimed federal pensions. So the Missouri Federal Soldiers Home was receiving not only state money, but federal money. And of course, that was not the case for the Confederate home. So indeed, the Confederate home had a larger state appropriation, but it wasn't necessarily an expression of unfairness or favoritism towards the Confederate home. I wanted to sort of take a moment now and talk about the general experience of living at the homes for the residents. And again, I'm going to sort of talk about them together because both homes, the daily life there was broadly similar. The veterans lived on large campuses, as we've sort of already seen, with multiple buildings, including dormitories, hospitals, chapels. They were provided meals, healthcare, laundry service. The Confederate home had a library. There were regularly scheduled entertainments and visiting hours. Both homes also operated on, as they called it, inmate labor. The residents were referred to as inmates. And so the veterans tended farmland and orchards on the grounds. The Confederate home had dairy cows. And so the residents were put to work to help maintain the operations of the homes. And this was, again, another way to kind of avoid that stigma of charity, right? These guys were not idle welfare recipients, right? They were working residents of these institutions. Both homes had strict sets of rules that the residents were expected to abide by, but you get the impression from reading the reports that sometimes these places could be a little tense. I think as any case where you have people, strangers living together in close proximity. One Confederate home superintendent complained, you cannot force the residents to respect each other. It is out of the question to attempt to try it. Sometimes the misbehavior was really trivial. The Federal Home Board expelled one resident for refusing to say prayer before meals. Apparently he was warned a couple times and refused to do it. They chucked him out. Other disputes were more typical of roommates. One Confederate veteran got in trouble for hitting his roommate over the head with his cane when the roommate left the light on too late at night. Another more serious incident occurred at the Confederate home when two residents disagreed over the election of state officers for their Confederate Veterans Association, and one man attacked the other with a knife. They were both ultimately expelled. Both homes also reported problems with alcoholism, although alcohol was totally prohibited at both institutions. I did find some evidence, though, that some of the Union veterans were running a moonshine ring out of the Federal soldiers' home, though the administration was quick to deny it. The association president, Louis Beneke, wrote, quote, "We cannot afford to have the report go out that our home is the resort of drunken men." In spite of their best efforts, though, surgeons' reports indicate that, yes, the men were drinking and sometimes also using opium. Substance abuse like this may have been a response to the dull routine of life at these places, to chronic pain, depression, or even war-related trauma. It's hard to know, and the staff at the homes were certainly not prepared to deal with the psychological well-being of these men. In fact, any resident who was considered insane would be discharged and transferred to one of the state's asylums or mental hospitals. So sometimes life at the homes could be pretty bleak. One Confederate home staff member reported, "These old men come to stay. They have nothing but the graveyard before them." And that reality didn't escape the veterans either. Death was very much a part of their routine. Surgeons at both homes recorded the deaths of every one of their residents, usually from natural causes, old age, heart disease, cancer. But sometimes there are more suggestive entries in these surgeons' reports as well. At the Confederate home, 2 men were listed as, quote, "killed by a train," while 2 more fell from porch, quote, and, quote, "another died from a fall," and still another reported simply as suicide. Can only speculate about the frequency of suicides in the home, but again, given the lack of mental health care for these veterans, it certainly occurred. So here's a photo of residents at the Confederate home wearing their gray uniforms as required of all the residents there. Here's more Confederate veterans inside the main building of the Confederate home. Here we are at the Federal home. We can see our veteran residents there wearing their blue uniforms as required by their rules and regulations. Here's a shot of one of the dormitories, so I think you can get a sense of why these veterans got annoyed with each other. Not exactly, you know, luxurious accommodations there and very little privacy. Here's a photo of some of the nurses on staff at the Federal home. And here's an image from about 1929 showing the residents of the Federal home. One of the groups that I think was particularly challenged and in some ways excluded from, you know, life at these homes was ultimately women. And in the case of the Federal home, I sort of wanted to acknowledge this because I think it's really interesting and important that despite all the work the Women's Relief Corps did to found and establish this home and to keep it running, following the state takeover in 1897, women found it more and more difficult to get admission to the Federal home. And finally, in 1903, the General Assembly voted to remove the Women's Relief Corps from the Board of Trustees of the Federal home. And the WRC felt really betrayed by this, frankly. President Holland E. Day said, quote, "The purpose for which the home was created has been defeated. We are denied any voice in the management of an institution which was created for us by long years of earnest endeavor." The state government justified its action in excluding women by saying that women were essentially taking advantage of the home. And it's almost like again, a turn of the century version of the welfare queen argument that women were abusing welfare initiatives. They pointed out that elderly veterans would often marry much younger women and that these women would then get admission to the home and then might, if their husband died, then might remarry in order to stay and gain the benefits of the home. This was their, again, the state's excuse that, quote, designing women abused the home. The board, the Federal Home Board, ultimately revised the rules, and in 1910 refused to accept any more applications from widows of Union veterans. One of the other aspects of the homes that I wanted to touch on was the way that they served, again, as not just as facilities to care for veterans, but in many ways as Civil War monuments. And I think this has to do with the work that the Women's Relief Corps and the United Daughters of the Confederacy did in commemorating the Civil War on the grounds of these homes. So even though the WRC lost their influence over the home board, they continued to care for the property, and particularly they cared for the cemetery, which we saw earlier. At the Confederate home, the UDC also maintained the Veterans Cemetery on the grounds, and they also helped construct, and I'll share my screen with you again, a Confederate monument on the grounds, which you can still see there today. Here it is, 1906, at its dedication, a monument to the Confederate dead. They also, oh, I'm sorry, here's another image of that dedication ceremony. A little difficult to see, but a large crowd. Supposedly there were about 8,000 people there on the day of the dedication. So really significant event. The UDC also, as the veteran population of the home declined into the 1920s and 30s, they succeeded in having the grounds converted to a memorial park. And in one form or another, over some various iterations, that's the reason why the grounds of the Higginsville home are a part of the Missouri State Park system today. So, you know, even though in the case of the federal home, women found themselves excluded under state management, in both cases, women remained very active in commemorating the Civil War on the grounds of these homes and making it really clear, you know, that these were sites of Civil War memory, that these homes were a way that Missourians could pay tribute and recognize their contributions to the Civil War. I'll conclude just quickly here by talking about the decline of the homes. So by the mid-1920s, the veteran populations were declining. The Federal Home Board began admitting widows again in 1923, and they also began admitting veterans of other conflicts, including the Spanish-American War. By 1929, Civil War veterans were a minority at the Federal Home, and the last Union veteran there passed away in 1944. Similar story at the Confederate Home. By the fall of 1940, there were only 4 surviving Confederate veterans left. In 1950, the last Confederate veteran at the Missouri Confederate Home passed away, and the state transferred the remaining widows to a local nursing home. So again, I think these veterans' homes are a really unique way to look at Missouri's complicated Civil War history, right? The fact that 2 exist speak to the deep divisions that existed in Missouri as a result of the Civil War, and that those divisions persisted well into the 20th century. But they also illustrate the desire of Missourians to find some kind of collective healing, or at least in the case of the white Missourians who populated these homes, right? They championed this effort to have both adopted by the state, that they would both receive state funding, and taking on this project, again, the Missouri state government became the only one in the country to operate twin soldiers' homes, as Vandiver called them. So I think these homes, again, can really speak to Missouri's unique and complicated Civil War history. Thanks.
Amy, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I just have a couple of questions for you. These topics kind of deal with local history in many ways. And tell me kind of the significance of using local history in your work.
That's a great question. I think that it's extremely important, especially as an educator, right? It's so easy to fall into the trap of talking about the Civil War as this North versus South conflict. But the closer you look at the community level, you can see how deeply divisive and complicated this war was, right? Particularly in a place like Missouri. And so I think that's really the value of local histories like this. It forces us to confront sort of all our presupposed ideas about the war and its history. And, you know, again, speaking as a Missourian, I think it's also that sort of level of local interest and engagement. It's fun to think about the place you live and to understand it a little better. I think it helps us, to borrow a phrase from a French historian, right? It helps us understand who we are now in light of who we are no longer. So I think it's important for sort of community identity. And again, also just to really add nuance to our thinking about the past.
So I'm always impressed at the role of women and the women that they play in commemoration, not just obviously with these hospitals, but in historic preservation and the role that women have played in the monuments. Can why is that?
That's a really great question. And I think it's, as you said, really true in the case of, you know, talking about Civil War commemoration. The lion's share of the work was done by women. I think that has a lot to do with gendered attitudes at the time. There are lots of, I think, sort of context to be derived from, again, gender attitudes at the time, and also sort of out of a Christian tradition that women are caretakers and record keepers. And so women took on very much so in the late 19th century, this responsibility for preserving history and, again, providing care as, you know, sort of their unique responsibilities as women. And also, I guess I should say, we're talking about a particular class of women, middle to upper class women who had the leisure time to be able to devote to these societies because they were incredibly active. These were jobs for these women. They're doing fundraising, they're having meetings all over the state. I mean, they're incredibly involved. It was incredibly time consuming, and again, something that really more particular class of women would be able to be involved in. But again, circling back around to your original question, I think it's all about gender attitudes at the time, which I think, again, sort of cast women in these roles as caretakers and record keepers.
And in many ways, from cradle to the grave. I mean, the decoration day,
Yeah,
taking care of the cemetery and,
right.
the monuments on the
And
various.
again, that's very strong, sort of, I think, part of the Christian religious context of these individuals too, that, women were responsible for the care of the dead. And in the case of the Federal Home, I found an interesting quote where one of the WRC members says, well, they kicked us off the board, but we can still take care of the cemetery, and that's what matters anyway. This is the work for the Women's Relief Corps to do. This is the work we relish, something along those lines. So yeah, they definitely, their efforts devoted a great deal of attention to the dead.
I mean, raising $100,000, that is that's an outstanding
And in
contribution.
I'd have to look at my notes, in just the matter of like a few months, really. It was incredible. And one thing that really struck me, these homes struggle to run on private charity, but it's interesting to me because not too long ago I visited the Oddfellows home in Liberty. Mm-hmm. And so that's another charitable institution, right, that existed at the same time as these homes, and it ran on private charity for something like, I don't know, 75, 80 years. And these veterans homes can't manage it, right, in the case of the Federal Home for even a full year. So that's always kind of puzzled me. But yeah, that initial fundraising effort is tremendously successful, but they can't keep it up for whatever reason. I've always found that interesting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was maybe they had more folks to take care of, as opposed to the Oddfellows. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other points that you'd like to add that you didn't cover?
Well, I guess if you'll indulge me, just one of the things
Sure.
I skipped over, so part of this, again, this sort of very gendered attitudes towards welfare that existed at the time, and this fear that veterans who moved to the homes were somehow less manly, right? One of the ways this sort of tension, I think, became really evident, for a brief window around the turn of the century, the residents of the Federal Soldiers' Home and possibly the Confederate Home, that I could never quite establish it, the residents of the Federal Soldiers' Home lost their right to vote because the Missouri state constitution said that residents of the state institutions were paupers and not entitled to vote. And so that issue had to be taken all the way up to the Missouri Supreme Court. And that was where the quote that I used to title my lecture came from, Tender of Both Uniforms. Missouri Supreme Court Justice Lamb says, "This is nonsense. Of course, we never intended for veterans to lose their right to vote. Missouri took on a unique responsibility caring for its veteran citizens of both armies." He says, "I don't care that Confederates once willingly renounced their citizenship. I'm not here to talk about that. These men are veterans. They fought bravely. They deserve the support of their state government, and they deserve to maintain their right to vote." But again, I think that shows how deeply ingrained this idea was that, you know, these negative associations with welfare, that you could deny a veteran their right to vote, really astonished me as I was doing the research.
So I guess my final question, do you think Missouri or Missouri, depending upon where you might be in the state, has recovered from the Civil War?
That's really interesting. I hate to give you a yes and no answer. I think, you know, growing up, I always thought very much yes. And in fact, you know, my experiences and classes and things growing up was that people didn't really know anything about the history of the war. Maybe they knew about Jesse James, but we talked so much more about Lewis and Clark and westward expansion, you know, sort of the hallmark of Missouri's history, again, in my experience growing up, than we ever did about the Civil War. But then, of course, you know, as I was finishing the dissertation stage of this research, you know, was the rioting and the violence in Ferguson, and now these, you know, conversations about removing Confederate monuments, that I think shows that in communities, you know, maybe not the community I grew up in, but in communities where there's a larger African-American population, a larger sort of complicated racial legacies stemming from this war, that yeah, it is very much alive. And I was just isolated from a lot of that in Jefferson City. So again, kind of yes and no, like you said, maybe it depends on where in the state you are.
Thank you very much for sharing with us about Missouri and its challenging attempts at reconciliation. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
All right.